The spindle on the 13th step had been loose for 3 weeks. I'd been meaning to fix it, but Clara kept saying we should hire someone. "You're a contractor, John, not a carpenter," she'd remind me, with that lawyer smile of hers, the one that made juries believe her and made me feel like I was missing something obvious. Before we dive deeper into this story, I have one small request. Please subscribe, drop a like, comment, and hit that hype button to boost this channel so more people can discover these incredible Reddit stories. I was tightening the damn thing when my phone rang. The hospital. At 3:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, while my wife was supposedly in depositions and my 10-year-old daughter Emma was supposed to be at soccer practice. "Mr. Davidson? This is Memorial Hospital. Your daughter Emma was brought in about 20 minutes ago." The screwdriver clattered down the stairs. "What happened? Is she okay?" "She has some bruising and a possible concussion. You should come immediately." I was in my truck before she finished the sentence, my hands steady on the wheel despite the ice in my veins. 23 years since Afghanistan, and I still knew how to compartmentalize panic. Save it for later. Focus on the mission. The mission was Emma. Memorial Hospital smelled like disinfectant and fear. I found Emma in room 314, looking small against the white sheets. Her left eye was swollen shut, and there were finger-shaped bruises on her upper arm. "Hey, Princess," I said, keeping my voice light. "Rough day at soccer?" She tried to smile but winced. "Daddy, I wasn't at soccer. I came home early because I forgot my science project." My blood temperature dropped another 10 degrees. "What happened, sweetheart?" Emma glanced at the nurse, who took the hint and stepped outside. My daughter's good eye fixed on mine with an intensity that reminded me of Clara during cross-examination. "Mom was home, with Uncle Richard. Richard Blackwood, my former best friend, my former business partner, and currently one of the city's most successful real estate developers. We'd served together in Afghanistan, started a construction company together when we got back, and I'd been stupid enough to trust him with both my money and my friendship. He'd screwed me out of the business 5 years ago, but Clara had insisted we stay civil for social reasons. "They were in your bedroom, Daddy. They didn't hear me come in. When I dropped my backpack, Uncle Richard got really mad. He grabbed me and said I shouldn't have been there. When I tried to run upstairs to my room, one of his men pushed me. I fell down the stairs." The ice in my veins turned to liquid nitrogen. His men? 2 big guys in suits. They were waiting downstairs while Mom and Uncle Richard were... She trailed off, but I got the picture. Crystal clear, high-definition picture. "Did they hurt you on purpose, Emma?" The one with sunglasses said accidents happen to little girls who see things they shouldn't. I kissed her forehead, tasting salt from tears I didn't realize I'd shed. "Nobody's going to hurt you again, Princess. That's a promise. Are you going to hurt them back?" Smart kid. Takes after her old man. "I'm going to make sure they understand that hurting you was a mistake." The nurse returned with discharge papers. Minor concussion, some bruising, nothing that wouldn't heal. But the rage building in my chest felt terminal. I drove Emma to my sister's house across town, spinning a story about needing to handle some adult stuff with her mother. Emma saw right through it, but didn't argue. She was Clara's daughter too. She understood the value of strategic positioning. The drive home gave me time to think. Richard had always been arrogant, but threatening a child crossed lines I didn't even know existed. And Clara, my wife of 12 years, the woman who'd sworn to love and honor me, had been screwing my worst enemy in our bed while our daughter lay unconscious in a hospital. Some people might call the cops, some people might hire a divorce lawyer, some people might break down and cry. I wasn't some people. I parked in our driveway at 7:23 p.m. Clara's BMW was there, pristine as always. I walked through the front door like I was coming home from any normal day, hung my keys on the hook by the door, and called out, "Clara, I'm home." She appeared at the top of the stairs, wearing a silk robe that cost more than most people's mortgage payments, Her hair was damp from a shower, and she had that post-workout glow that I now realized had nothing to do with the gym. "John, you're early. How was work?" "Interesting. How were depositions?" Something flickered behind her eyes. "Long, boring, you know how it is." I walked to the kitchen and opened a beer, taking my time. Clara followed, her bare feet silent on the hardwood floors. "Emma's at Sarah's tonight," I said casually. "Thought she could use a sleepover after her accident." "Accident?" Clara's voice climbed half an octave. "What accident?" "Someone pushed her down our stairs this afternoon, gave her a concussion." I took a long pull from the beer and watched Clara's face cycle through surprise, fear, and calculation before settling on concern. "Oh my God, is she okay? Why didn't you call me?" "I tried. Your phone went straight to voicemail. Funny thing about that, Emma said she came home around 2:30, said she saw some interesting things." Clara's hand went to her throat, a tell I'd noticed during our early dating days when she was nervous. "What kind of things?" "The kind of things that involve you, Richard Blackwood, and two guys in suits who think it's acceptable to threaten 10-year-old girls." The mask slipped completely. For just a moment I saw the real Clara, calculating, cold, and caught. Then the lawyer training kicked in. "John, I think there's been a misunderstanding. Emma was probably confused after her fall. You know how children can what? Hallucinate the smell of Richard's cologne? Imagine bruises shaped like adult fingers? Make up stories about men in suits?" I set the beer down and stepped closer. Clara backed against the kitchen island, and I realized she was actually afraid of me. Good. She should be. "Here's what's going to happen," I said quietly. "You're going to pack a bag and find somewhere else to sleep tonight. Tomorrow, we're going to have a conversation about how this marriage ends. And if Richard or his goons come within 100 yards of Emma again, they're going to discover that some of us actually paid attention during combat training." Clara's chin came up, and I saw a flash of the woman who'd made partner before 30. "You can't prove anything, John. And even if you could, do you really want to destroy our family over a misunderstanding?" "Sweetheart," I said, letting my voice drop to the tone I'd used on insurgents who thought they were tougher than they were. "Our family was destroyed the moment you let that bastard into our bedroom. I'm just deciding how much collateral damage there's going to be." She tried to stare me down, but 12 years of marriage had taught her to recognize when I'd reached my limit. She nodded once and headed upstairs to pack. I finished my beer and started planning. Clara left that night with 2 suitcases and a wounded dignity that would have been touching if she hadn't spent the afternoon betraying everything we'd built together. She didn't ask where she could reach me, and I didn't offer. I spent the evening in my basement workshop, cleaning my tools and thinking. The workshop had been my sanctuary since we'd bought the house, a place where everything had a purpose, and problems could be solved with the right application of skill and pressure. The problem upstairs was more complex than a loose spindle or a squeaky hinge, but the same principles applied. Identify the weak points, apply pressure systematically, fix what could be fixed, and replace what couldn't. Richard Blackwood had weak points. I'd known him for 15 years, served with him, built a business with him, and watched him screw over everyone who trusted him. He was successful because he was ruthless, but ruthless people make enemies. And enemies talk if you know how to listen. I made a call. "Pete Kowalski." "Pete, it's John Davidson." A pause. Pete had been Richard's sergeant in Afghanistan, and when Richard had stolen my construction company, Pete had chosen sides. The wrong side, from my perspective. But I understood the math. Richard had money and connections. I had principles and a mortgage. "John, it's been a while." "Not long enough. I need information." "About what?" "About Richard. About his business practices, his associates, his vulnerabilities. About everything you've learned working for him over the past 5 years. Another pause, longer this time. "That's a hell of a thing to ask, John." He had my daughter threatened by his security team yesterday. She's 10 years old, Pete. The silence stretched until I wondered if he'd hung up. Then Pete sighed, and I heard 20 years of friendship in that sound. Meet me at Murphy's bar tomorrow night, 8 o'clock. And John, come alone. Murphy's bar sat in the kind of neighborhood where people minded their own business and paid in cash. I arrived 15 minutes early and claimed a corner booth with good sight lines to both exits. Old habits. Pete showed up precisely at 8, looking older than his 42 years. 5 years of working for Richard had carved lines around his eyes and added gray to his hair. He slid into the booth across from me and ordered whiskey. I stuck with beer. You look good, John. Clean living agrees with you. Cut the shit, Pete. What do you have for me? He laughed, but there wasn't much humor in it. Straight to business. I always liked that about you. He took a sip of whiskey and leaned forward. Richard's dirty. Not just corner-cutting dirty, federal investigation dirty. What kind of federal investigation? Money laundering, mostly. He's been washing cash for some very unpleasant people through his development projects. The FBI has been building a case for 18 months. This was better than I'd hoped. How do you know? Because one of his security consultants is actually a federal agent. Guy named Martinez. He's been documenting everything. And you know this how? Pete's smile had sharp edges. Because Martinez approached me 6 months ago. Turns out the Bureau was interested in my perspective on Richard's operation. I studied Pete's face, looking for tells. You're cooperating with the FBI. I'm considering it. Richard's not the man we served with, John. He's become something else. Something that needs to be stopped. What about loyalty? What about it? Richard threw you under the bus 5 years ago, and he's been screwing your wife for God knows how long. How much loyalty does that buy him? The casual way Pete mentioned Clara's affair told me everything I needed to know about how well Richard kept secrets. How long have you known? About Clara? 6 months, maybe 7. Richard likes to brag when he's drunk, says she's his prize for winning the war between you two. I finished my beer and signaled for another. The rage was still there, but it was cold now, controlled, useful. I want everything you have on him. Financial records, client lists, security protocols, personal habits, everything. That's asking me to burn a lot of bridges, John. Consider them already burned. The question is whether you want to be standing on the right side when they collapse. Pete finished his whiskey and stood up. I'll be in touch. He left me sitting in the booth, staring at the foam in my beer and thinking about the difference between justice and revenge. Justice was what happened in courtrooms, with judges and juries and appeals. Revenge was personal, creative, and infinitely more satisfying. I was definitely interested in revenge. The next morning brought a text from Clara. We need to talk. Meet me at Starbucks on 5th Street at noon. I arrived 10 minutes late, a small power play that Clara would recognize and resent. She was sitting at a corner table, wearing her armor, a perfectly tailored business suit that probably cost more than I made in a week. Her lawyer face was fully engaged, confident, controlled, slightly condescending. Thank you for coming, she said as I sat down. You said we needed to talk, so talk. She folded her hands on the table, and I noticed she wasn't wearing her wedding ring. Interesting tactical choice. I think we both said things yesterday that we didn't mean. This situation has gotten out of hand, and I think we should step back and approach it rationally. Which situation? The one where you're screwing Richard Blackwood, or the one where his thugs threatened our daughter? Clara flinched at my tone but held her ground. Emma misunderstood what happened. She was confused after her fall. Her fall? Is that what we're calling it when grown men push children downstairs? Nobody pushed Emma, John. She tripped. Richard was there on business, and when she fell, he helped her. She misinterpreted the situation. I leaned back in my chair and studied my wife's face. 12 years of marriage, and I was just now seeing her clearly. She wasn't confused or scared or even particularly sorry. She was calculating the angles, looking for the story that would minimize her exposure and maximize her advantage. "What business was Richard conducting in our bedroom, Clara?" Her composure cracked slightly. We were discussing a case, a real estate matter that involved some of his properties." "Naked?" "Don't be crude, John." "Crude? My wife is involved with my worst enemy in our bed, and you think I'm being crude?" People at nearby tables were starting to stare. Clara's face flushed, but she kept her voice level. "If you're determined to be unreasonable about this, then perhaps we should discuss it through our attorneys." "Our attorneys?" "Sweetheart, I'm a contractor. I have a lawyer who handles permits and liability insurance. You're a partner at one of the city's most prestigious firms. How exactly do you think that fight is going to go?" She smiled then, and I saw the sharp determination that had made her so successful in court. "Exactly the way you'd expect it to go, John. I'll get the house, primary custody of Emma, and enough alimony to maintain my lifestyle. You'll get visitation rights and a substantial debt load. And what does Richard get? Richard gets to continue being successful and wealthy, while you get to continue being bitter and middle class." I stood up and dropped a $5 bill on the table. "Thanks for clarifying things, Clara. This conversation has been very educational." "Where are you going?" "To work. Some of us still have jobs that require showing up." I walked out of the coffee shop feeling lighter than I had in years. Clara had just made the same mistake that had cost Richard our business partnership. She'd underestimated me. She saw a blue-collar contractor who was outgunned and outclassed. She didn't see the combat veteran who'd spent 2 tours learning that the best way to win a war was to make the enemy defeat themselves. That afternoon, Pete called. "I have something for you. Meet me at the construction site on Maple Street tonight at 10, the one Richard's developing." "Why there?" "Because I want you to see something. And John, bring a camera." The Maple Street development was Richard's latest project, luxury condos for young professionals with more money than sense. I'd bid on the construction contract 2 years ago and lost to a company that submitted a bid so low they had to be cutting corners somewhere. Now I knew where. Pete was waiting for me in the shadow of the half-finished building, wearing dark clothes and looking like the special operations veteran he'd once been. He handed me a hard hat and a flashlight. "Building inspector comes tomorrow morning," he said quietly. "Richard's been cutting corners on materials, bribing inspectors, and falsifying safety reports. If this building gets occupied, people are going to die." We climbed through the structure, and Pete showed me everything wrong with it. Substandard concrete, inadequate steel reinforcement, electrical work that violated 6 safety codes. It was a disaster waiting to happen, wrapped in granite countertops and stainless steel appliances. "How many buildings has he done like this?" I asked. 7 in the past 3 years, maybe more. I took pictures of everything, documenting the violations with the thoroughness of someone who'd once had to write reports that could mean the difference between success and failure. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. This was about preventing a catastrophe. "Why are you showing me this, Pete?" "Because you're the only person I know who'll do something about it. Richard owns half the building inspectors in the city, and the other half are too scared to cross him." "What about the FBI?" "They're focused on the money laundering. They don't care about building codes." We climbed down from the structure and walked back to our cars. Pete handed me a manila envelope. "Financial records, client lists, and security protocols, like you asked. There's also something else in there you might find interesting." I opened the envelope and found photographs. Clara and Richard entering a hotel together. Clara and Richard leaving the same hotel 3 hours later. Clara and Richard having dinner at an expensive restaurant while Emma was at a sleepover. "How long has this been going on?" I asked. "At least 8 months. Probably longer." 8 months. While I'd been working 60-hour weeks to pay for Clara's lifestyle and Emma's private school, My wife had been conducting a relationship with the man who'd already destroyed my business. The betrayal was so complete, it was almost artistic. "There's one more thing," Pete said. "Richard's planning something big. A development project that would require him to acquire several properties in the Riverside district. Properties that are currently occupied by low-income families. Eminent domain? Worse. He's been buying up the mortgages and foreclosing on people who've never missed a payment. Families are losing homes they've lived in for generations." I thought about Emma's bruised face and Clara's cold calculation and Richard's smug certainty that he could take whatever he wanted. Some people needed to be stopped, and some people needed to be destroyed. Richard Blackwood needed to be destroyed. "What do you need from me?" Pete asked. "Time and distance. When this starts, you don't want to be anywhere near Richard or his operation." "And when does it start?" "Tomorrow." I spent that night in my workshop, planning. Military operations succeed because of preparation, intelligence, and understanding the enemy's weaknesses. Richard's weakness was his arrogance. He believed he was untouchable because he'd never faced real opposition. He was about to get an education. The next morning, I made 3 phone calls. The first was to the city building inspector's office, anonymously reporting safety violations at the Maple Street development. The second was to the FBI field office, requesting a meeting about federal crimes I'd witnessed. The third was to Emma's school, arranging to pick her up early. Emma was waiting for me in the principal's office, looking small in her school uniform, but alert in the way that told me she'd inherited more than just Clara's intelligence. "Are we going somewhere, Daddy?" "We're going to visit your Aunt Sarah for a few days. I have some work to do, and I want you somewhere safe while I do it." "Is this about Mom and Uncle Richard?" Smart kid. Too smart, maybe. "Yes." "Are you going to hurt them?" I considered lying, but Emma deserved honesty. "I'm going to make sure they face consequences for their choices. Sometimes that hurts." "Good," she said, with a vehemence that surprised me. "Uncle Richard scared me. And Mom. Mom chose him instead of us." I hugged my daughter and promised myself that whatever happened next, Emma would never have to be afraid again. That afternoon, I met with FBI agent Martinez at a diner downtown. He was younger than I'd expected, with the kind of intensity that came from believing in justice. I gave him copies of Pete's financial records and my photographs of the building code violations. "This is excellent work," he said, flipping through the evidence. "We've been trying to establish a pattern of criminal behavior, and this provides exactly what we needed. How long before you can move?" "Weeks, maybe months. Federal investigations take time." "I don't have months. Richard threatened my daughter." Martinez looked up from the files. "Mr. Davidson, I understand your frustration, but you need to let us handle this through proper channels." "And while you're handling it through proper channels, Richard keeps laundering money, keeps building unsafe structures, and keeps threatening children. If you take matters into your own hands, you could jeopardize our entire investigation." I stood up and dropped $20 on the table. "Agent Martinez, I spent 2 tours in Afghanistan learning that sometimes the proper channels don't prevent harm. Richard Blackwood is a clear and present danger to my family. I'm going to neutralize that danger. Mr. Davidson, I'm advising you not to—" "Advise away, Agent Martinez. Just make sure you're ready to move when the opportunity presents itself." I walked out of the diner, knowing I'd just burned my bridges with federal law enforcement, but I'd also planted seeds that would grow into something Richard couldn't bribe or intimidate his way out of. That evening, I drove past Richard's penthouse apartment building and studied the security arrangements. 2 guards in the lobby, cameras at every entrance, keycard access to the elevators. Standard corporate security, designed to keep out casual intruders and process servers. It wouldn't keep out someone who'd spent years learning how to penetrate enemy positions. But I wasn't planning to break in. I was planning something much more elegant. I was planning to make Richard destroy himself. Richard's weakness wasn't his security or his money. or even his arrogance. His weakness was his need to be seen as untouchable. He'd built his entire identity around the image of success, and that image required constant maintenance. I was about to become his maintenance problem. Monday morning, I drove to Richard's office building and parked across the street. At exactly 8:15 a.m., Richard's black Mercedes pulled into the executive parking space. He climbed out wearing a suit that cost more than most people's cars, straightened his tie, and walked into the building like he owned the world. In about 10 minutes, he was going to discover that the world had other ideas. I waited until he'd had time to reach his office, then made the first call. Blackwood Development, this is Jennifer. This is Inspector Williams from the City Building Department. I need to speak with Mr. Blackwood immediately regarding violations at the Maple Street project. I'm sorry, Mr. Blackwood is in meetings all morning. Can I take a message? Ma'am, this is regarding immediate safety hazards that require the project to be shut down pending investigation. Mr. Blackwood needs to call me back within the hour or will be forced to involve the district attorney's office. I hung up and made the second call. Channel 7 News, this is Rebecca. I have information about a story involving unsafe construction practices and city corruption. Are you interested? 20 minutes later, my phone rang. This is Richard Blackwood. Someone from your office called about the Maple Street project. Mr. Blackwood, thank you for calling back. We've received reports of serious safety violations at your development. I need to schedule an immediate inspection. There are no safety violations. My projects exceed all city standards. Sir, we have photographic evidence of substandard materials and code violations. This inspection will happen today, with or without your cooperation. A pause. I could almost hear Richard's blood pressure rising. Who filed the complaint? That's confidential information, sir. I want to know who's making these accusations. Mr. Blackwood, the source of the complaint is less important than the validity of the concerns. Can you meet me at the site at 2 p.m.? I'll be there. The real Inspector Williams would be confused when Richard showed up for a meeting he'd never scheduled, but that confusion would last only until he saw the actual violations. And by then, Channel 7 would be filming the whole thing. I spent the morning making similar calls to Richard's other projects, creating a cascade of inspections, investigations, and media attention that would keep him busy for weeks. Each call was carefully crafted to sound official and urgent, and each one would lead to real consequences when the authorities followed up. At 1:45 p.m., I positioned myself across from the Maple Street development with a pair of binoculars. Richard arrived at exactly 2 p.m., followed by a Channel 7 news van and the actual building inspector, who looked as confused as I'd expected. The conversation was animated, Richard pointing and gesturing, the inspector taking notes and shaking his head, the reporter asking questions that Richard clearly didn't want to answer. Within an hour, the site was shut down, and Richard was driving away with the kind of rigid posture that indicated barely controlled rage. Phase 1 complete. That evening, Clara called. John, what the hell do you think you're doing? I'm watching the news. Interesting story about unsafe construction practices. Did you see it? You know damn well I saw it. Richard says you're behind this harassment campaign. Richard says a lot of things. Most of them are lies. This is going to stop, John. Whatever you think you're accomplishing, it's going to backfire. Is that a threat, Clara? It's a promise. Richard has resources you can't imagine. If you keep pushing, he's going to push back. I'm counting on it. I hung up and poured myself a whiskey. Clara was right about one thing. Richard would push back. But she was wrong about my ability to handle it. Richard fought like a businessman, using money and influence and legal pressure. I fought like a soldier. Tuesday morning brought the first counterattack. I arrived at my current job site to find two men in expensive suits talking to my foreman. They had the look of lawyers or accountants, soft hands, hard eyes, and the kind of confidence that came from never having been punched in the face. Mr. Davidson, we're from the State Licensing Board. We need to discuss some complaints that have been filed regarding your work. What kind of complaints? Safety violations, permit irregularities, customer disputes, serious allegations that require immediate investigation? I looked at my foreman, Tommy, who shrugged apologetically. Sorry, John. They showed up an hour ago with paperwork. The paperwork was thorough and official-looking, but I recognized Richard's handiwork. He was trying to shut down my business the same way I was shutting down his projects, through regulatory harassment. Gentlemen, I'll be happy to cooperate with any legitimate investigation. My records are available for review, and my work speaks for itself. Mr. Davidson, pending the outcome of this investigation, we're suspending your contractor's license. They handed me a document that would effectively put me out of business until the allegations were resolved. It was a smart move. Richard was cutting off my income while tying me up in bureaucratic knots. But he'd made one mistake. He'd assumed I needed my business to survive. I didn't. I had savings, I had skills, and I had something Richard would never understand: the ability to live without the things that defined me. Thank you for the notification, I said politely. I'll be in touch with my attorney. After they left, Tommy walked over with a concerned expression. John, what the hell is going on? I'm at war with someone who thinks money makes him bulletproof. He's about to learn otherwise. Anything I can do to help? I looked at Tommy, 55 years old, built like a truck, loyal as a dog, and realized I had resources Richard couldn't imagine either. Actually, yes. How would you and the boys like to make some extra money? That afternoon, I met with my crew at Murphy's Bar. 8 men who'd worked construction for decades, who understood the difference between right and wrong, and who'd seen their industry corrupted by people like Richard Blackwood. Here's the situation, I said. Richard Blackwood has been building unsafe structures, bribing inspectors and threatening families. He's also screwing my wife and trying to destroy my business. I'm going to stop him, but I need help. What kind of help? Asked Danny, my best carpenter. The kind that involves making Richard's life very complicated, very publicly, and very expensively. Is this legal? Mostly, and the parts that aren't legal won't hurt anyone who doesn't deserve it. Tommy raised his beer. Richard Blackwood screwed over my brother-in-law 3 years ago. I'm in. One by one, the others nodded their agreement. By the end of the evening, I had a crew of volunteers who understood that sometimes justice required getting your hands dirty. Wednesday morning, Richard's troubles multiplied. His luxury car wouldn't start. Someone had disconnected the battery and filled the exhaust pipe with expanding foam. His office building lost power for 6 hours due to a mysterious electrical problem that required extensive investigation. 3 of his active construction sites were shut down for permit violations that hadn't existed the day before. And everywhere Richard went, he found protesters. Tommy's union friends had organized picket lines at Richard's properties, carrying signs that read, "Unsafe construction causes harm," and "Blackwood builds hazardous structures." The protests were legal, peaceful, and highly visible. They were also driving Richard insane. He called me at noon. Davidson, you son of a jerk. I know you're behind this. Behind what, Richard? I'm just a suspended contractor with no business to run. I've got plenty of time to watch the news, though. Looks like you're having a rough week. This ends now. You're going to call off your dogs, or I'm going to destroy you. How? You've already stolen my business, corrupted my wife, and threatened my daughter. What else you got? You have no idea what I'm capable of. Actually, I do. I've known you for 15 years, Richard. You're capable of betraying friends, bribing officials, and building structures that could collapse and harm people. But you know what you're not capable of? What? You're not capable of fighting someone who's got nothing left to lose. I hung up and smiled. Richard was angry, which meant he was going to make mistakes. And when he made mistakes, I'd be ready. Thursday morning, Richard made his biggest mistake yet. I was having coffee at a diner near Emma's school when Pete called. his voice tight with urgency. "John, you need to get Emma somewhere safe, now." "What's wrong?" "Richard's lost his mind. He's talking about sending a message, making an example. His security team is asking questions about Emma's school, her schedule, where she goes after class." The coffee cup shattered in my grip, sending ceramic shards across the table. "He's targeting my daughter?" "I think so. I'm not sure, but I heard enough to know you should take precautions." I was already moving toward my truck. "Where are you now?" "Richard's office. He's meeting with some very unpleasant people, not his usual business associates. These guys look like they solve problems permanently." "Get out of there, Pete, right now." "I'm trying, but—" The line went silent. I called Emma's school and told them I was picking her up immediately due to a family emergency. Then I called my sister Sarah and told her to pack a bag and meet me at a location we'd discussed but hoped never to use. 20 minutes later, Emma was in my truck with a confused expression and a backpack full of hastily gathered homework. "Daddy, what's happening?" "Uncle Richard has decided to escalate our disagreement. We're going to make sure you're safe while I handle it." "Are you going to hurt him?" I looked at my 10-year-old daughter, who'd already seen too much of the world's darkness, and made a decision that would define the rest of my life. "Yes, sweetheart. I'm going to hurt him very badly." I delivered Emma to Sarah's house with instructions to stay there until I called. Then I drove to Richard's office building and positioned myself across the street with a clear view of the parking garage. At 3:47 p.m., Pete stumbled out of the building, his face bloody and his left arm hanging at an odd angle. He made it to his car and drove away, but I could see he was hurt badly. At 4:15 p.m., Richard emerged with two men who looked like they'd stepped out of a mob movie. They talked briefly, shook hands, and separated. Richard got into a new Mercedes, apparently he'd replaced the one I'd sabotaged, and drove toward the residential district where I lived. The two men got into a black SUV and followed him. I called 911 and reported a break-in at my address, then followed the convoy at a distance. If Richard was planning to send a message by vandalizing my house, he was going to discover that some messages got returned to sender. But Richard wasn't planning to vandalize my house. He was planning to burn it down. I watched from 3 blocks away as the black SUV parked in my driveway, and the two men got out carrying gas cans. Richard stayed in his Mercedes, making phone calls while his hired criminals prepared to destroy everything I owned. That's when I realized Richard had made a fatal error in judgment. He thought this was about property, about money, about winning and losing in the conventional sense. He didn't understand that this was about survival. I called Tommy. "It's time. Bring everyone to the address I gave you. And Tommy, bring the heavy equipment." While Richard's arsonists were soaking my house with gasoline, I was mobilizing an army of construction workers who understood the value of building things and the sin of destroying them. Tommy arrived first, driving a bulldozer that belonged to our former company. Danny came next in an excavator, followed by the rest of the crew in various pieces of heavy machinery. We positioned ourselves at the end of the block and waited. At exactly 6 p.m., smoke began rising from my house. That's when we moved. 8 pieces of construction equipment rolled down my street like mechanized cavalry, engines roaring and warning lights flashing. The two arsonists ran for their SUV, but Tommy was faster. The bulldozer blade caught the SUV's rear bumper and flipped it onto its side. Richard tried to drive away, but Danny was waiting with the excavator. The bucket came down on the Mercedes's hood with a sound like thunder, crumpling the engine block and trapping Richard inside. I walked over to the Mercedes and looked through the spider-webbed windshield at the man who'd destroyed my business, corrupted my wife, and threatened my daughter. "Hello, Richard. We need to talk." He was bleeding from a cut on his forehead, and his expensive suit was torn, but his eyes still held that familiar arrogance. "You're insane, Davidson. You'll go to prison for this." "Maybe, but you'll go first." I pulled out my phone and showed him the screen. "I've been recording everything for the past week. Your building code violations, Your money laundering operation, your threats against Emma, and now attempted arson and conspiracy to commit insurance fraud. You can't prove anything. Richard, I don't have to prove anything. I just have to create enough reasonable doubt to destroy your credibility. And credibility is all you have left. Fire trucks were arriving to deal with my burning house. Police cars were surrounding the scene. News vans were pulling up to document Richard Blackwood's very public downfall. "What do you want?" he asked. "I want you to understand that actions have consequences. You stole my business, so I'm destroying yours. You corrupted my wife, so I'm exposing your affairs. You threatened my daughter, so I'm ending your ability to threaten anyone. Clara will never leave me. She knows which side her bread is buttered on." I laughed, and Richard flinched at the sound. "Richard, Clara's a lawyer. She's smart enough to know when a ship is sinking. How long do you think her loyalty will last when the FBI freezes your assets?" As if on cue, Agent Martinez appeared at the passenger window of the Mercedes. He held up a badge and a warrant. "Richard Blackwood, you're under arrest for money laundering, racketeering, and conspiracy to commit arson." They pulled Richard out of the wreckage of his car and put him in handcuffs. As they led him away, he looked back at me with something that might have been respect. "This isn't over, Davidson." "Yes, it is." The fire department saved about half of my house, which was more than I'd expected and less than I'd hoped. I stood in the ruins of my living room, looking at the charred remains of 12 years of marriage, and felt nothing but relief. Sometimes you have to burn things down before you can build them back up. Clara appeared as the fire trucks were leaving, her face pale with shock and calculation. She surveyed the damage with the expression of someone trying to determine how a disaster would affect her personally. "John, I'm so sorry. Richard told me he was going to talk to you, but I never imagined—" "Cut the shit, Clara. You knew exactly what Richard was planning. You just didn't care as long as it didn't touch you directly. That's not true. I would never—" "You would never what? Betray your husband? Endanger your daughter? Conspire with criminals?" I stepped closer, and Clara backed away. "Sweetheart, you've already done all of that." "The police said Richard was arrested. What's going to happen to him?" "Richard's going to prison. His assets are being seized, his business is being shut down, and his reputation is destroyed. In other words, he's getting exactly what he deserves." "What about me?" There it was. The question Clara had been building up to since she'd arrived. Not concern for Emma's safety or regret about the marriage she'd destroyed, just worry about how Richard's downfall would affect her. "What about you, Clara?" "I need to know where I stand. Financially, I mean. With Richard gone and the house damaged." I stared at my wife, soon to be ex-wife, and marveled at her ability to focus on money while standing in the ashes of our life together. "You stand exactly where you chose to stand, Clara. On your own. You can't just abandon me. I'm your wife." "No, you were my wife. Now you're just someone I used to know who made some very poor choices." I walked away from her, leaving Clara standing in the ruins of the house she'd helped destroy. There would be lawyers and paperwork and custody arrangements, but the important part was over. Richard was finished, Clara was exposed, and Emma was safe. Everything else was just details. Pete was in the hospital with a broken arm and 3 cracked ribs, but he was alive and talking. I visited him the next morning, bringing coffee and gratitude. "How did you know Richard was planning to target Emma?" "I heard him on the phone with those 2 thugs. He was talking about sending a message that would make you back off permanently. It didn't take a genius to figure out what he meant." "Why did you warn me? You could have stayed out of it." Pete shifted in his hospital bed and winced. "Because some things are more important than paychecks, John. Richard crossed a line when he went after your kid." "What are you going to do now?" "Agent Martinez offered me a deal. Full immunity in exchange for testimony about Richard's operation. Turns out the FBI has been very interested in my perspective." "And after the trial?" "I'm thinking about getting back into construction. I hear there's going to be a demand for contractors who actually follow building codes. I shook Pete's good hand and promised to stay in touch. He'd risked everything to protect Emma, and that was the kind of loyalty that couldn't be repaid. The media coverage of Richard's arrest was extensive and unflattering. Channel 7 ran a series of investigative reports about unsafe construction practices, city corruption, and the dangers of unchecked corporate power. Richard's photograph appeared on the front page of the newspaper under the headline, "Builder of Hazardous Structures Arrested." His reputation was destroyed so thoroughly that it would never recover. Clara filed for divorce 3 days later, citing irreconcilable differences and asking for primary custody of Emma plus substantial alimony. Her lawyer was expensive, aggressive, and completely unprepared for what I'd learned about his client. Mrs. Davidson is seeking a settlement that reflects her contributions to the marriage and her need to maintain stability for the couple's daughter, he said during our first meeting. Mr. Peterson, I replied, your client spent 8 months conducting an affair with a man who threatened our daughter and tried to burn down our house. I have photographs, recordings, and witness testimony documenting her relationship with a federal criminal. How exactly does that translate to alimony and custody? The settlement negotiations lasted 6 weeks and ended with Clara getting exactly what she'd contributed to our marriage's destruction. Nothing. I got full custody of Emma, the insurance money from the house fire, and the satisfaction of watching Clara's lawyer explain why her case had collapsed. Emma took the divorce better than I'd expected, probably because she'd already processed the reality of our situation. Kids are resilient that way. They adapt to new circumstances faster than adults. Are we going to build a new house, Daddy? We are. Would you like to help design it? Can I have a bigger room? You can have whatever you want, Princess. We're starting over. The new house rose from the ashes of the old one, built with insurance money and constructed by men who understood the difference between doing things right and doing things cheaply. It was smaller than the original, but stronger, with better materials and cleaner lines. Like the life I was building with Emma, it was designed to last. Richard's trial began 8 months later and lasted 3 weeks. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence of money laundering, racketeering, bribery, and conspiracy. Pete's testimony was devastating. Agent Martinez's investigation was thorough, and the building code violations I documented proved that Richard's criminal enterprise had endangered hundreds of lives. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Richard Blackwood was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison and ordered to pay restitution that would consume every asset he'd accumulated through his criminal activities. His business empire collapsed, his properties were seized, and his name became synonymous with corruption and greed. He would serve every day of his sentence in a medium-security facility where his money and connections meant nothing. Clara found work at a smaller law firm across town, handling divorce cases and personal injury claims. She lived in a modest apartment and drove a used car, a dramatic come-down from the lifestyle she'd grown accustomed to as Richard's mistress and my wife. She was allowed supervised visitation with Emma twice a month, visits that were awkward and brief. Emma was polite but distant, treating Clara like a stranger she was obligated to spend time with rather than a mother she missed. The last time I saw Clara, she was leaving the courthouse after another unsuccessful attempt to modify our custody arrangement. She looked older, harder, worn down by the consequences of choices she'd made in pursuit of excitement and status. "John," she called out as I walked to my truck, "can we talk?" I stopped and turned around, studying the woman who'd once been the center of my world. "What about?" "I want you to know that I'm sorry. About Emma, about the affair, about everything. I made mistakes." "Yes, you did. Is there any chance? Could we try again? For Emma's sake?" I looked at Clara, really looked at her, and saw someone who'd learned nothing from her experience. She was still calculating angles, still looking for the easy path, still believing that the right words could undo years of betrayal. "Clara, you didn't make mistakes. You made choices, You chose Richard over your family, excitement over stability, immediate gratification over long-term happiness. Those weren't accidents or errors in judgment. They were decisions that revealed who you really are. People can change, John. Some people can. You're not one of them. I walked away from Clara for the final time, leaving her standing in the courthouse parking lot with nothing but the consequences of her choices for company. 6 months later, Emma and I were sitting on the porch of our new house, watching the sunset and talking about her day at school. She was 11 now, taller and more confident, with the kind of resilience that comes from surviving difficult experiences. Daddy, do you ever miss the way things used to be? Which part? The part where your mother was lying to us, or the part where Uncle Richard was threatening us? Emma laughed. I guess when you put it that way, things are better now. Much better. We don't have to worry about people we can't trust, and we don't have to pretend everything's okay when it isn't. Do you think Mom is happy? I considered the question carefully. Clara had chosen her path, and she was living with the results. Whether that constituted happiness was between her and her conscience. I think your mom is exactly where she chose to be, sweetheart. And so are we. Emma nodded and went back to her homework. I sat on the porch for another hour, watching the stars come out and thinking about the difference between justice and revenge. Justice was what happened in courtrooms, with judges and juries and appeals. It was slow, imperfect, and often unsatisfying. Revenge was personal, immediate, and infinitely more effective at changing behavior. Richard Blackwood had learned the difference between the two, and so had Clara. They discovered that actions have consequences, that betrayal carries a price, and that some people fight back when you threaten their children. Most importantly, they'd learned that underestimating your opponent is the fastest way to lose a war. I'd won this war completely and permanently. Richard was in prison, Clara was irrelevant, and Emma was safe. The collateral damage had been extensive: a marriage, a business relationship, a house, and several illusions about trust and loyalty. But some things are worth the cost of victory. Emma was one of those things. As I locked up the house and headed inside, I reflected on how completely my life had changed in less than a year. The scared contractor who'd received a phone call from the hospital was gone, replaced by someone who understood that sometimes the only way to protect what matters is to destroy what threatens it. Richard and Clara had taught me that lesson, and I'd taught them one in return: that crossing the wrong person's family is the last mistake you'll ever make. It was a lesson they'd have the rest of their lives to remember.